Can you hear me? I have behind. No. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Humanitarian Hub and to this session on leveraging crisis data to inform climate action. And we have a fantastic panel of expert speakers here beside me today. My name is Michelle Yonatani. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at UNHCR on climate action. Very happy to join just to moderate the session. And I'll be handing over for all of the really substantive content to Jeremy Wetterwald, who's a Senior Advisor on Climate, Environment and Migration Impact Initiatives, to Catalina Jaime, who's the Head of Climate and Conflict at the Red Cross Climate Center, to Chris Richter, who's the Regional Migration, Climate Change and Environment Specialist based in Bangkok for IOM. Chris. And to Irakli Malania, who's a humanitarian officer at OCHA based in the South Caucasus. But to start us all off, it's my great honor to introduce Rose Kobusinger, who is IOM's Africa Youth Changemaker for Uganda, East and the Horn of Africa. So if you'd like to come up, Rose, we'd love to hear some opening remarks from you as an IOM youth delegate. So, Rose, you're looking currently... Please come on up, Rose. Yeah. And Rose is looking at locally led climate action. So what, in your view, Rose, is currently missing from a data and evidence perspective?
Well, good evening, everyone. It's quite a tricky moment to speak at this time when everyone is tired. But with this amazing panel and speakers, I think we'll get back the energy at the end of the day. So it's really interesting to speak about data, like today's topic being how can humanitarian data be leveraged to inform climate action in crisis-affected contexts. For me, when I think about it, I can't think of any other sector that should be having more data than the humanitarian sector. But sometimes that's not true because you find that the sector is a little bit not coordinating as it should. You find people have data here and there. It's not also like readily available. So I think from the youth perspective, one thing I can take back when we were working on the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change, one of the requests and recommendations that young people in the Eastern Horn of Africa made was the need for evidence-based, human rights-based, child-sensitive and gender-sensitive data. And one thing I remember we focused on was if that data doesn't result into action, into policy and action at the grassroots level, then we don't need it. Because we have so many cool reports on academic websites, great data reports on the websites of our cool organizations represented here. But from a young person's perspective, don't quote me wrong, I'm also a researcher, and sometimes I get frustrated with myself because we focus so much on, how to write and how to present academically, but we've forgotten the impact aspect. And data without impact, for me, is like writing on water because for the communities I work with, the displaced communities, the internally displaced communities that are displaced because of climate change, the refugees that I work with, they don't mind if you have your data in core reports or not. If they don't see your report resulting into action, actually most of them are tired of researchers coming to ask them things. There's that fatigue coming through. So we focused, as young people, that we want to be part of the research. Provide scholarships for young people to engage in research, call for proposals for young people to present their data, and but also not just presenting in terms of dissemination. Those big reports, no one is going to read them, So finding cooler ways to present this data and research that you do, and that is where you need the young people to complement the work that you're doing. TikTok is there, Facebook. I mean, that one is a lost cause these days, but X now requires people to pay, but there's TikTok and Instagram, the reels, the stories, and that is why the collaboration with young people as a valued constituency, not as this is something we've been pushing for, valuing young people, not seeing them as lesser, but also really valuing the input that they provide and the skills that they bring on table as equal partners. And the other thing that we looked at, again, in the humanitarian spaces, we have this structure of having to employ consultants to do the research. And I think our recommendation was, if you're employing a consultant, one of the things you have to encourage them to do, you don't have to dictate, but encourage them to engage young people in the data collection, the data cleaning, but also as participants in the data collection. The other thing, again, from the Kampala Declaration point of view, as young people, the recommendations we made is like, sometimes I get really demotivated when I go to panels, people say, we need more data. The data is there, the evidence is there, except that, like indigenous knowledge, for instance, it's not considered as data. And who is defining data? So the point I'm trying to move to is the decolonization of data and knowledge. Decolonialization of data and knowledge, because what the Western countries think is data, and they think this indigenous and local knowledge is not data, is misguided. Because if we listen to the indigenous communities, the local communities, the elderly communities, whether it's on disaster preparedness, whether it's on emergency proactive action, and we need to listen to that too. And of course, back it up and complement it with whatever surveys we make or scientific data. There shouldn't be a fight between these two. They should complement each other. And I'd already talked about collaboration at the beginning. There's so much working in silos. I know you know it better than I do. You always talk about it. And I think it's time we find a better way to collaborate, but also make data accessible for everyone. I know you invest in this data and collecting it, so you don't want to just make it free for everyone because you invested in it. But I think in the humanitarian world, I believe we are impact-driven, empathy-driven. We want to see a change in people's lives, in the way they are protected, and social dialogue. And I think when we go back to those basics, we realize it's not more about protecting the money we invested in collecting data, but having people have access to this data so that we don't just, like repeat what others have done. I mean, you can repeat what others have done, but from an informed point of view, maybe make it better. So young people would want to partner with you as partners, as collaborators, as complementarities, rather than as a smaller constituency. And I think we're seeing that partnership coming in strongly these days, at least the last few years, we've seen a great change. But I would re-emphasize that maybe you've heard about this. As an African, if you just Google anything about Africa, you're going to find very few African written reports, even in the IPCC, even anywhere. So if you can look into your own positionality, there's no one who can tell an African story or a displaced person's story, a migrant story, a refugee story, more than a refugee, more than that person themselves. Give them roles to take active roles, not passive roles. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Rose. Powerful words. And I think your message was really loud and clear that we're talking about data for action, for climate action, data that's accessible, data that absolutely involves the youth and the affected communities as participants in collecting and using data. And we're very much reminded of your powerful role as youth delegates and youth more broadly in terms of disseminating all of the findings, the data, making it something that has meaning, has results, if you like, for local communities, those affected on the front lines. And indeed, on the silos point that you were making, I think That's very much one of the purposes of our event today. It's about really trying to bring together those research and practitioner communities to think about how indeed can we use that data for action that reduces the vulnerabilities of communities at the forefront of overlapping shocks. And that requires a really high degree of understanding of drivers, of humanitarian needs, of drivers of fragility and conflict, and of disaster risk. So indeed it needs to bring together in a very integrated way knowledge for action. So now I'm going to turn to our panelists here and ask you to actually explain to us, indeed, as Rose was just telling us, there's so much data out there already. So let's hear more about what is actually out there. And I'm going to turn first to you, Catalina, from the Red Cross. And the Red Cross indeed is the largest humanitarian network, very strongly grounded in communities. How do you work with them to generate and capture high quality and reliable knowledge that informs action in the field?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, first of all, I feel very honored to talk after you, Rose. This is so lovely to be able to kind of like follow on the things that you were saying, because I think what I wanted to say is very aligned to many of the things that you were mentioning. So I do feel that there has been many years of work in the Red Cross on like just making sure that those community participatory processes to gather data, to understand risk, get, really reach and really get to a point that we can scale them up. So basically, since the 70s, we have been doing participatory appraisal processes, like so many ways of working with communities. The challenge is that it's always these little pocket interventions here and there and here and there, which are very special and they have been very valuable. But I think we are at the moment of time that we can take what we call in the Red Cross vulnerability and capacity assessments, or we call them actually now enhanced vulnerability and capacity assessments, to a next level. And this is really about having a process to work with communities, to partner with the communities, to understand risk, and ultimately, like really, to just do that process to plan, to define, okay, what are the actions that need to happen? What is important? And at the same time, the co-benefit of it is that then we have very rich data sets that in the ideal world, then we can consolidate and then we can have and use them for kind of humanitarian related prioritization and for like so much like work. Like one of the pieces of work that I have been advocating for many years, related as well with these vulnerability and capacity assessments, is the use of OpenStreetMap within the context of a lot of these community-based participatory processes. Because anyways, we're doing mappings with the communities, and many times those maps just stay in the communities, but they don't really get, they don't get really to a unified system. And it is good. So it is as simple as really connecting these two processes and making sure that we are contributing to that community level process of data that will have that humanitarian impact, and that in the ideal world would really have that impact into the big map of the world that will help us really to understand risk. So that's one element. There's one extra element that I wanted to mention that is this relates more to weather and climate related data. So we know that in many places of the world we have a big gap of observations. Like it's really quite big, particularly in conflict-affected contexts. It's a blind spot. So there is an opportunity to use the existing investments, because there is a lot of money at the moment on this type of observations, but then basically work with communities for them to first take care of those meta stations that will record the data, to maintain them, to basically take the data and make sure that is going to be kind of uploaded. So I think that's another element like that we need to kind of like continue pushing forward, because there is a lot of potential to making sure that we can cover, or we have better weather and climate data in these gigantic blind spots that we have at the moment in the world. With that, over to you.
Thanks so much, Catalina. Okay, moving on. We've got so many more examples to share. So now over to you, Jeremy. And Impact and the REACH initiative are indeed supporting the humanitarian coordination architecture with generating vast amounts of data to inform effective humanitarian action. Can you share with us, though, how some of this data can actually be used for climate action?
Thanks a lot, and really thanks a lot, Rose, for your intervention, because I think I'm actually going to reply a lot to the points that you've made. As you've mentioned, we as a humanitarian ecosystem we generate a lot of data, either through primary data collection or remote sensing analysis. We fundamentally believe in the importance of open source data, making data accessible for the communities, and that has been at the core of everything we do. And so just reflecting a bit on our experience on developing these multi-sector needs assessments that inform OCHA-led humanitarian needs overviews and response plan, which is basically the planning mechanisms of humanitarian action. At the forefront of that exercise has been two important things that relate to Rose's intervention. A, transparency. What are we collecting? Why are we collecting it for? Is it genuinely informing humanitarian action in the field? And two, openness, right? It has to be available to other research communities in order to kind of maximize the value of that. And so I often use an analogy of how do you get to local action, right? Let's say you're at the country level and you're managing a big pool of humanitarian funding, right? The big HNOs, HRPs are about $1 billion a year, right?
So those?
HNOs and the humanitarian response plans, so the kind of plans that allocate humanitarian funding, can be more than $1 billion per year. That's not a small amount of money, right? You're having to then make decisions on where are the needs, right? Are they in those cities versus that cities? And this is where we try to help a lot with our multi-sector needs assessment. You need to understand who are the vulnerable communities, right? Who's most affected by those crises? And of course, not forgetting marginalized group, harder to reach communities. And this is something that we've seen a lot in the humanitarian ecosystem, that you have kind of vulnerable dimensions within fragile and conflict affected contexts. And finally, how do you link it to local action? And that's extremely, extremely difficult to do at scale. And that reflects a lot of the work that we've been trying over the last 5-6 years on building what are called area-based assessments. So pretty much like community level, city level assessments, where we look at different sectors, water, health, housing. We look at different groups, refugees, displaced, host communities. And very importantly, we try to do things in a way that's multi-stakeholder, where we look at both CSOs, local authorities, and humanitarian actors, right? And so to answer the question, how can we leverage some of that data to inform climate action? Having followed the kind of the understanding of risk work that a lot of the DRR community have been doing over the last few years, there's a lot of consensus that in terms of understanding what's dangerous and where, the Earth observation and GIS does that quite well. There's been huge amounts of progress in our ability to deploy these tools at scale in the world's most fragile context. But talk to any researcher in that context and they will tell you what's always and systematically missing is the vulnerability data. Where are the groups that are most vulnerable? Where are the forgotten groups? And the reason it doesn't exist is because it's hard, right? It's difficult to go in those places because of security access, because we don't even know they exist. I was recently in DRC, and you have entire displaced communities that are just in outskirts of cities that we don't even know. So how do you put these people on the map? It requires ground presence, it requires working with the communities, and so that's why I'm delighted to be on the panel and that you raised all those very important roles on bringing that data locally to enable local level action. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And it's actually a good reminder that in spite of there being so much data out there that we need to leverage together much better, there are still some gaps, in fact, right? And you've highlighted there on vulnerability, on conflict-affected areas. I think, Catalina, you also referred to on these remoter areas, remote communities. And there again, of course, youth and local communities themselves having a huge role to play in making sure that those gaps get filled. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Over to you now, Chris. So at IOM, you have something called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, which is a tool or a box of tools, if you will, and which is now operational in more than 100 countries, I believe. So could you just explain to everybody, because I don't think that's so well known here in the COP policy circles, right? Like, what is this DTM, Displacement Tracking Matrix, and how can this important displacement data be used when operationalizing climate action programs?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that question. And indeed, we've heard a lot at this COP over the past week and a half and others as well about the need for climate action to be based on the science and the evidence and all of that sort of thing. And usually when we're talking about that in this context, we're talking about the causes and consequences of anthropogenic climate change. But of course, there's science and data and evidence out there from other sectors, including the humanitarian sector, which is equally important to these discussions about climate action and how we respond to that. And so indeed, one of the tools that we at IOM uses is, as you mentioned, the Displacement Tracking Matrix, or DTM, which is a tool that we've been using or rolling out since 2004, actually, first in Iraq, and as you mentioned, now to over 100, I think it's now 120 something countries around the world in that time. So it has a long history of development and use, and in fact it's, we were discussing, it's sort of been recognized as one of the key sources of data on internal displacement for the ISC system. So, I mean, the DTM essentially is a tool to try and provide multi-layered information on needs of displaced populations in particular, and it has sort of four main elements to it. One of it is looking at mobility tracking, which is essentially trying to quantify the number of people in a particular geographic area who have been displaced, and to look at their needs and so on. We have a flow monitoring component, which is more about looking at the movement of people through particular places, so it could be border areas and things like that. We have a registration component as well, which is it's focused on providing some form of identity, not legal identity, but sort of functional identity to support access to humanitarian services and all of that sort of thing. And then it has a survey component as well, which is sort of, obviously it's, as you were saying, it's incredibly difficult at times to reach some of these populations. So, despite our best efforts, we often just sort of resort to sort of doing that sort of survey-based approach to sort of get an overview of the types of needs of particular groups and in particular places. And the neat thing about the DTM is that it is very much a modular approach, so we can apply all of these four elements or one or two of the elements depending on the particular needs in the places that they're rolling out to. And another key thing is that we're trying increasingly to work with different partners on the ground to try and reach the types of communities that perhaps in the past haven't been as accessible, first of all, but then to also think about some of those gaps that we've been discussing as well, and to see how the DTM can be leveraged to try and fill those gaps for different stakeholders, different partners that we're working with. And so, we have a partner toolkit that sort of addresses the potential use of the DTM in, I think it's about 12 or 13 different sort of thematic areas, everything from cash-based interventions to protection to WASH, even things like mine action, and really trying to see how we can leverage the sort of rich data that is available to support interventions across the board, working with the different humanitarian partners. So it's definitely one of our flagship tools that we use in this context, but again, trying to build those partnerships to expand its use and value even further, including in the context of sort of climate related interventions. So in Africa, for example, where we're using it also to support a transhumance tracking tool, which uses those same sort of methodologies and modules to try and address the impacts that climate change is having on sort of traditional herder communities across Africa, and to get ahead of, you know, potentially some of the flashpoints or areas of conflict where those paths move to new areas that, you know, hadn't been there before. So that's sort of one of the examples, I guess, of how we're trying to leverage it in this context of climate change as well.
Great, thanks, Chris, and highlighting there for us as well some of the very different types of contexts in which you're actually gathering that data. Very, very interesting to think about, including for the transhumants, for the pastoralists, and so on. Thank you for highlighting that. Now turning to you, Irakli, from OCHA. And can you tell us a little more about how OCHA is the coordinating entity in the UN system, how humanitarian data from your perspective is being generated via the, to inform and can be used to inform, climate action?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, and I hope you can...
Maybe take another mic.
Thank you. I hope you are able to hear me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. For the past week, we have been hearing a lot about climate financing and how we are also working through different dimensions on different types of anticipatory action programs. But I think today's discussion about data and using data as a tool to make evidence-based decisions is a key angle. And Rose has so rightly raised many different dimensions of data collection: transparency, accountability, data sharing, access to these data through various sources. I think these are all very important angles, and we do live in an area where there's a lot of information, but also leveraging this information to make informed decisions in the humanitarian context, I think is a journey that needs a very careful consideration. So in that regard, OCHA since 2014 has been coordinating humanitarian data exchange platform, which brings together different types of data sets, because we are working with data sets that work on population statistics to seeing disaggregation data on gender and different meaningful elements of our humanitarian program planning processes. And we do consider this data as most valuable, because otherwise you are lost in the world of information, and your programs are not really reaching the affected population that mostly needs this assistance, and for what reason OCHA was created for in the beginning. But the cluster sector approach that OCHA brings also applies to the data exchange, because we have to make sure data is actually a means of exchanging information. In essence, it's a language that we should be able to speak and we should be able to understand. Of course, data comes from a methodology-based process, but at the same time, we should be able to speak about this without big barriers in between us. So this implies on risk matrix that we are using in different contexts and measuring the impact and effect on the population, and this brings the vulnerability assessments, which are at different levels depending on a context. And through the cluster sector system, we are trying to understand the capabilities of this, the response measures in different contexts and how effective they can be to bridge the gaps that any potential government might not be able to fill. And this brings me to a point which talks about climate impact data, which has been the newest data set in the humanitarian data exchange. It's not at its perfect state. This data has been added since 2022. Jamie has mentioned humanitarian needs overviews, humanitarian response plans. Of course, humanitarian needs overview is a larger overview of a snapshot of what happens in a concrete context that leads to development of a humanitarian response plan. And this response plan, of course, has its calculations, and these calculations oftentimes are based on very concrete needs, and concrete needs that are emerging in a context where we have to intervene. In this regard, I have to mention that based on what we are able to track, only 27% of climate impact data on humanitarian response plans is up to date. So there is this is a priority, and and everybody understands this. And this is a priority for a lot of the Central Emergency Response Fund anticipatory action programs. But in this case, we have to also understand that from a transparency perspective, there are a variety of stakeholders, and we have to make sure that humanitarian data exchange platform successfully brings the stakeholders together. These are your international and national humanitarian partners. These are your government counterparts. These are your academia, and academia that brings all of that scientific knowledge that you need to understand this climate impact data. And what is climate impact data? We have to also talk about the components that go into this. So there are three actually main components that we have to consider. One of them is past hazards. So how accurate is your historical data of hazards? So if you are doing a hazard modeling, per se hailstorms, you have to have an understanding on in what frequency and in what shapes and size it has been coming. Second one is actually impact data. How has it been impacting concrete communities in given contexts, and understanding has anything changed in past decades, 5 years, and is that really impacting how these communities are actually trying to deal with the actual damage. And the third aspect is forecasting, which is actually, of course, scientific based, and our task is to make sure that these all three aspects are playing well together. Somebody that comes from an office that works with the local context, taking South Caucasus into mind, having access to historic data is a problem. Some of this data is missing, and you have to then find creative ways. How do you bridge this gap in data? And one of the examples that comes to my mind is, of course, when we talk about climate risks, you have different scientific methods, right? Some of them use regional approach, and they look specific regions. Some of them look at river basins. But we have to we had to do a modeling of hailstorms in Georgia, where our UNTP colleagues had to bring in data from a similar geographic context, bringing the video with actual ongoing data sets that they had for the given time from the meteorological agency, and try to build a scientific model that would then predict how certain communities would be impacted. Of course, this then leads to your early warning systems and how successful you're able to communicate with populations. But there are many important angles that we really have to make sure that they work together, that they are able to exchange amongst themselves. And in this regard, as a coordinating agency, we think that there is an important angle when we talk about data, actually coordinating data exchange and making sure that it's accessible. And of course, when we talk about humanitarian assistance delivery and data exchange, it's through and with local communities. Without that local knowledge, this information, in essence, can be quite useless. So we have to make sure that our humanitarian programming processes are reflective of this knowledge and can actually quickly build on and deliver this assistance through all these financing mechanisms that we have already discussed through many sessions. But I want to make sure that remains on data and access to this data. Thank
Absolutely. Thank you so much there, Irakli, for highlighting these different types of data as well. The hazard data, the impact data, the forward-looking forecasting data, not least to inform early warning systems and anticipatory action, which I think in the humanitarian sector, we're discussing more and more and more and trying to get more and more serious about actually implementing it, right? So thanks for highlighting that. As I'm coming from the UN Refugee Agency, I just add a little bit on top of that, just say, of course, and our coordination around also with the refugee data, right? And refugee hosting areas, as the OCHA, what you're referring to is primarily around the internally displaced and local affected populations in humanitarian context, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So we have to bring it all together. Great. Now let's step away a little bit from the crisis context. I'm going to turn to you, Luftor, last but certainly not least, from ICAD. I understand you're currently doing research on how communities are experiencing loss and damage in Bangladesh. And from what you've heard and in your view, what would be interesting data that would help your research?
Thanks the moderator, and thanks our nice speakers. So we are conducting a research in Bangladesh. This is actually for access to land for displaced population. So we are doing this research in primary cities and as well as in the secondary cities as well. So we have found the people, our displaced people are affected by the loss and damage. We found the different scenario for the different disaster events. So if we saw in the PowerPoint, so we can look the people who are displaced by the river erosions. They are lost everything, their house, their properties, everything, and also as well as they lost their ecology, stability, and rapid displacement, and also the non-economic loss and damage they faces. That is the psychological distress and the anxiety due to loss of insecurity, because they can't say this is our location, and they faces the identity crisis about when they are asked about their place, where their place. And in the flood we have found that faces the infrastructure damage, also house, also roads, and also we have found the economic loss and damages for the agriculture crops and domestic animals, also the communication, actually the transportation sector, they losses everything. And if we talk about the cyclone and storm surge scenario, they will find they losses the biodiversity and natural resources, and also the high recovery cost when they come back to their original situation. And also in the coastal southern part we have found that the cyclone and storm surge increases the salinity and also damage their crops. And also if we talk about the others mean heat stress, drought, all the slow onset event like a salinity induction. So we have found that the labor productivity, loss of labor productivity is due to because of the heat stress, and also their productivity loss. So and also their gradually income reduction. So that is the another thing that happened in the different type of, in the context of different type of disaster they are displaced. And also we have found that people are displaced in the emergency time. They get about 30% of response, but 30% of humanitarian assistance, but 70% they don't have any assistance. So I will come back later when I will talk about the collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for raising, I think it's very interesting, even from what you're showing here on the screen, when you're talking about loss and damage, I think it actually highlights for us there are areas of overlap with what we're talking about traditionally in terms of humanitarian data and needs, and how that really does what you're doing. There are linkages, but it's also bringing up other issues which are not traditionally, let's say, addressed by humanitarian data, I don't know, around cultural identity, biodiversity, and also in terms of longer timeframes that are required for recovery, reconstruction, building resilience, right? So thank you so much for bringing that in. And indeed, I think we're going to move on now to a second part of our discussion, which is really about, okay, so we have all of this data, huge amounts of data being generated, but how do we bring all of these ecosystems in terms of data together, right? And I know all of you have got plenty of different experiences. I'd like you to, quite briefly, but just try and give us some concrete examples. I believe, for example, you, Jeremy, have some examples from South Sudan and Haiti.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michelle, and thanks a lot, Lutfor, as well, for your introduction on the loss and damage. I think, as you rightly highlighted, there's huge amounts of overlap, but there's a lot of things that we need to continue developing, that the scientific and research communities needs to become better at. And so the few concrete examples of how do you bring research communities at the country level, I wanted to highlight an example from South Sudan, where in partnership with UNDRR, we started doing some hazard exposure analysis that directly fed within the OCHA Humanitarian Needs Overview and Humanitarian Response Plan. So we were trying to actually bring analysis that helps you risk inform humanitarian planning, right? We talk about climate resilient development, risk informed development, you call it, but how do you actually bring DRR research into humanitarian planning, right? We replicated this approach in Haiti. So we started doing hazard exposure analysis of flood hazards and of earthquake hazards. So again, going in the non-climatic angle as well, comprehensive risk management type of approach. But what was very interesting about this exercise is that you really saw to what extent humanitarian planning was not super familiar with the amount of tools and approaches that exist from the DRR community. And I think we have a lot of DRR practitioners in this kind of climate humanitarian ecosystem, and I think we're all seeing a bit the same thing.
What's DRR?
Sorry, disaster risk reduction. Apologies for that. But then to the point of what we were trying to say on bringing that data at the local level and the community level, what we started doing over the last 5 years is, in addition to that needs data, in addition to that impact data, let's bring the risk element to it. And so that's where, again, using geospatial analysis, using GIS, bringing that attention on both natural hazards that are linked to climate change, but also man-made hazards, right? We're talking at the highest levels of policy level of a climate and nature crisis, right? And so not to add even an additional layer of complexity, but we should start putting in your biodiversity folks. And I was recently talking to one of the chief of data of IPBES, and he was talking, I was asking him, biodiversity loss, how do you measure it? He says with satellite. Oh, it's great. I happen to like satellites myself too. And so there was a bit of that exchange happening between those research communities. And I think that while I think at global level we're making a bit of effort, at country level it's still extremely difficult because our funding sources are different, blah, blah, blah. But I really think that the magic happens when you do this analysis in the same city, in the same area, because we can all then exchange notes. And I'd be delighted to do work, in an area in which ECAD is working, or within areas that others are working in. How do we bring those ecosystems within an area to get a common understanding of what's happening? Over.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, and I think you're making me reflect a little bit also in terms of approaches that we're kind of bringing together. You're talking about disaster risk reduction, risk management, comprehensive risk management, but maybe just a reminder that even under the Warsaw International Mechanism, under the UNFCCC, under the convention system, there's a group there, an expert group there, working already on comprehensive risk management. So recognizing that you can't just look at climate risks in a silo, you actually have to also bring them together, not least in terms of thinking about vulnerability, social vulnerability as some are calling it here, right? So, great. How about you, Catalina? Can you tell us something about your experiences from Burundi and Mozambique?
Yes, I will concentrate in Burundi, and I think it's just like a perfect segue because it's really one of the things that is exciting me the most, because it's basically the World Bank has this big ambition since the last 4 years, working with the Burundi government to do basically climate action at the lowest level in Burundi, which is the colline level. And this amazing, brilliant person in the World Bank, which is a visionary called Aram Toll, had an idea. She was like, I want to do this differently. I want to do like an non-World Bank traditional kind of thing. And so she called it the Climate Center. And basically, we thought about a process of how to inform that gigantic investment of the bank using somehow humanitarian processes to deliver climate action in the ground. So the first thing that we did was basically to do this comprehensive risk analysis process, which it was so beautiful because it basically brought together a lot of IOM related information. It brought climate projections for the Cordex, data sets, the latest for Africa. We even included something that I was so excited with my teams. We wanted to understand how the legacy of conflict had an impact on vulnerability in Burundi. So we did this whole methodology process to also pinpoint that. We even worked with the University of Stanford that were specialists on like land degradation because Burundi has a lot of like landslides, and so that needed to be another element. So basically we just added layers and layers of like complexity into the process to lead to an identification of what are the top like high-risk places in Burundi. Like Burundi has like 3,300 collines. So of course it's very complex. You need to prioritize. So basically out of that process, there was kind of like a zoom in on the top ones. And there was this kind of like decision of, okay, out of these there are like 400 or something like that are like top vulnerable, where that money from the bank from climate action should, be located. Now the next step that is going to happen and imminently is that the idea is to use that Red Cross vulnerability and assessment capacity process that I was telling you to go to those 400 collines in Burundi to do the community at the local process. To do what? To make the plan and then to do the allocation of funding. It's it's one of the most beautiful examples that I can think, and it's just happening as we speak, and it's just quite exciting.
Wow, well, your enthusiasm is definitely shining through here today, Catalina. Sometimes data can be a
I'm
dry
tired.
topic. I know, but you see, these guys are absolutely passionate about this because it makes a difference, right? It really does make a difference for action on the ground. So thank you for bringing your passion and enthusiasm here into this discussion. And it's just reminding me as well that, sometimes I feel there's a tension and people saying, yes, but is that really climate action related? Are you going a bit outside the mandate? As soon as we're starting to talk about climate impacts beyond the physical climate science, more into what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 is talking about, indeed vulnerability and impacts, that if you really want to understand climate impacts on people and nature, right, you really have to bring in this much more integrated approach. So thank you so much again for highlighting that. Right. Now let's go over to Asia and Pacific with you, Chris. Can you share a few examples from there?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously I'm from IOM, and our mandate is around migration, human mobility. And so in the context of climate change, we're really concerned about looking at the linkage between climate and environmental change and how that plays out in terms of different forms of human mobility, including migration, displacement, planned relocation, things like that. And in the Asia-Pacific region, maybe I'll take a step back. I guess sort of one of our broader ambitions around this topic is to sort of improve governance around it and to support, the communities that are most impacted and to work with governments to do that. Now, in my region, the Asia-Pacific, this is a particular priority given the significant vulnerability across the region, given the fact that it already experiences more disasters and also more disaster displacement than any other region. At the same time, the region seems to be going backwards in relation to the climate-related SDGs. We see, carbon emissions continue to rise in the region, built on the back of, continued over-reliance on fossil fuels, also linked with significant environmental degradation. And so we see significant need for governments to take action on this topic, right? And in the Pacific, a lot of governments are very much engaged in this. They're very much at the forefront of discussing the issue and developing solutions to it. But across the rest of the region, South and Southeast Asia, the discussion's a little bit nascent to the extent that it exists at all. And I've sort of been trying to grapple with why is this the case, right? And one of the things that comes up, and Rose mentioned it, of course, is the issue of data. And this is coming from our government partners as well. They're always talking about the need for more context-specific and government-owned evidence and data on this, which is interesting also because of what Rose said, and others have mentioned it as well. I think that there is already a lot of information out there. And you mentioned the IPCC report. I mean, if you look at that, it provides a very comprehensive overview of the latest state of knowledge and evidence on this topic. And it does highlight that, climate and environmental factors are both direct and indirect drivers of, human mobility, including displacement, but also sort of migration as well. And so, we're trying to grapple a little bit with the fact that there is so much data out there already, and yet governments are telling us, no, we need something else. We need something that's owned by us and that addresses the issue in our particular context. And so one of the sort of a new initiatives we're also rolling out in the Asia Pacific region is this thing called the Risk Index for Climate Displacement, which is also trying to get at one of the key questions that governments and a lot of people always want to know about in this context is how many people are going to move, where are they going to move from, all of that sort of thing. Which, there have been many studies on this in the past with, often questionable methodologies, or it's sort of like we'll just look at the number of people in a particular place and overlay that with hazards and sort of say, well, okay, if there's flooding, then maybe this number of people will move just based on sort of impact and that sort of thing. But of course, it's much more complex than that, and, the drivers of human mobility in the context of climate change are multifaceted, touches upon socioeconomic vulnerabilities, political issues, governance issues, all of that sort of thing to determine whether or not people stay or go. And so this risk index is sort of another attempt that we're making on trying to provide that sort of granular operational foresight data, looking at, first of all, some of the underlying drivers, looking at those socioeconomic, political, development factors, overlaying that with some of the more immediate triggers of potential displacement, whether it's loss of livelihoods, loss of territory, food or water insecurity, and then also trying to sort of think a bit more about, well, what are the tipping points as well? What are the climatic factors that will make it no longer possible for these people to stay in a particular place. And so we're hoping that will provide us with a little bit more, as I was saying, of that sort of granular data to look at the populations and the places that will be most impacted. And the neat thing about this risk index as well is that it is, we're developing it through a co-creation mechanism. So we're working with universities and experts in the region. So Rose mentioned as well that there's not enough, in the African context, not enough of this research done by African institutions, and we see the same thing in the Asia Pacific region as well. And so that's a really key thing that we want to try and address by working with these local institutions. So there's a little bit more of that ownership as well for the local context. And in addition to that, and this is sort of the key thing, also going to something that we're talking about in terms of data without impact, is linking this with a climate catalytic fund. So we'll use the index to try and identify populations and places of interest, and then bring in some funding. So we'll use a co-financing mechanism to work with all the organizations in those particular places to try and identify solutions. And I think what we're hoping is that we can sort of make some immediate quick win impacts by doing that, and hopefully to sort of leverage additional support and funding beyond that as well. But to really start from the community level, working with them to identify the challenges, but also possible solutions, and to provide some support to hopefully scale up from there.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. I think you're reminding us within a huge number of really good points you're making there, that sometimes indeed it's about data for what, being really clear on that. So it's not just quantity, but is that data fit for purpose, or what the needs are to enable that action, including via funding decisions, right, as you're mentioning. And that tension I think we always have with data, this discussion keeps going on year after year. Policymakers, actors on the ground, they want that crystal ball. But the reality is, especially with climate change, that we're seeing increasing levels of uncertainty that's adding into that uncertainty that humanitarians know is often part of the realities we face every day. So that ongoing tension. Irakli, could you say a little bit more about from the humanitarian coordination point of view again about how you can bring or how you are bringing research and data entities together?
Absolutely. There's something that we need to understand, that there is an essential data that we absolutely need for any type of planning purposes, and these are for what we call the common operational data sets, CODs. This is an essential work that we as OCHA try to coordinate, that's accessible on humanitarian data exchange. So once, God forbid, something happens, we are not spending 5 meetings on agreeing what are these common operational data sets. So we have it updated regularly, and that's one stream of work that we are making sure is ongoing. The other angle that has come into play is climate impact data. Something that we are seeing has shown great results is warnings on impact on agriculture through EU Joint Research Center, which is up there, and we hope that we aspire the standard to have it on climate impact data as well, but at the same time making sure that we are understanding the premises of risks, because an earthquake itself happening should not be a devastating hazard. In a particular context, you have to have risk premises that have certain indicators that would give you triggers and that would give you warnings. So in this regard, making sure that you are harnessing the local knowledge through your academia and institutions, governmental institutions that are able to collect this scientific data is very important. And OCHA has successful examples through its anticipatory action work that we are doing within the premises of the Central Emergency Fund, where we have successfully signed agreements with Fiji, Mozambique, with their meteorological agencies, including Bangladesh's flooding institutions and early warning systems. And these examples are there. Replicating them requires further work, and making sure that not only this data is collected, but it's accessible for all humanitarian and non-humanitarian actors. So when there is a need, they can quickly act on it. And I think that's an important angle, that once a natural or human-induced hazard strikes, we have very short window to respond, and what OCHA's priority lies is that assistance is delivered quickly, and assistance is delivered to the most affected, and we have to make sure that this stays at the forefront of any type of data collection that goes forward, and it will only make our work even more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. We can hear indeed that there are so many forms of data, many different tools out there, many different models. I have a somewhat simple question, I guess, to ask you here, Lufdor, before we start to wrap up, and maybe just check if there are any questions from the floor for those of you here, in case you have something, get ready. What's your number one ask, basically, to all of these crisis data actors to support your research and to help bridge between what you're doing with maybe different timeframes and so on, and what these guys are doing?
Thank you again. So give me the floor. So in our research, when I'm doing the access to land for the displaced person, we do research in 4 contexts. One is the origin, where they displaced. 2 is the near destination, and 3 is the planned relocation site, exactly the government intervention there, and also the destination. Destination means in the informal settlement or the slum area. So in the 4 contexts, we have found that there are the different needs for them. They have faces the different problems, so they ask for different support. So what it could be, like the river erosion, where the people are displaced by the river erosion. At that time, they need the emergency support, like the humanitarian support they needs. And also, when we are talking about the different type of losses, economic and non-economic losses, so which kinds of losses we can measure by the different tools that Jeremy shares. Could be the different way. And also the people, when they displaced, after they displaced, they don't found any assistance and also the support or also the recovery for the housing or settlement. So at that time, so they need a DTM, like a disaster tracking metrics. So like this, the which type of peoples from where they're displaced and where they go actually. Is their near destination or the final destinations? So we have found several times of good solutions like a humanitarian organization do for the early warning system. In Bangladesh, we have found that around 167,000 of volunteers who are working at that time in the early warning system. But they are working in the cyclone system, but other sector are absent, like the floods. But in floods, we have found that different types of philanthropic organization, also the civil society works there for the humanitarian assistance. Also, when we're doing the research on the people are displaced where they go actually, so we have also tracking about them and where the need is. And also we have found that the people who are displaced and live in the informal settlements, some of the NGOs are working with them after the displaced, and it's called climate bridge fund by the BRAC NGOs, one of the programs. So they are doing support, some sort of support they're doing for their better livelihood. So this data we can collect from the different organization, and we use in our impacted for the help of the impacted people, and then we can help them as well in their crisis time and also the long-term resilience make them. Thank you.
And indeed, I mean, what we're seeing is sort of crisis upon crisis for many of these communities in very exposed and vulnerable areas. So, yeah, I can see perhaps also that even the kind of research and the data you're collecting could be really helpful for informing humanitarian action, not least in terms of baselines, like where we're all starting from the humanitarian sector. That's brilliant. And just coming back to where we are here, in the COP space, we're talking in this sort of humanitarian bubble all of a sudden again here in the Humanitarian Hub. But in the COP space, we're talking about loss and damage, we're talking about adaptation, and we're focused here on data and evidence, and it's quite clear, I think, that the kind of humanitarian data with the other kind of complementary research that you're doing, for example, absolutely has a role to play in informing the decisions of the fund for responding to loss and damage, for inspiring, I guess, requests for technical assistance under the Santiago network on loss and damage. So really like trying to sort of like encouraging those requests for support, that awareness that, look, all of this is out there already that can be drawn on by countries and by communities themselves. And even around indicators. I mean, I've just been following some of the global goal and adaptation discussions around the UAE Bellum work program on indicators and how you're going to measure that, data for that. All of that is data at different levels, which is hopefully indeed going to result in action on impact on the ground for highly vulnerable populations. Thank you all. I don't believe we actually have any questions from our audience here today. So I'm just going to invite one of the lead organisers, Jeremy, for Impact Initiatives, to actually wrap up and conclude for us this session with a few of your quick reflections.
Thanks a lot, Michelle, and really thanks a lot. It's so great to have you on that panel with that research on loss and damage at a moment where the reflection, as you mentioned, Michelle, on prioritization for the fund responding to loss and damage, the fact that we have a mechanism, the Santiago network, that's operational, or in the at the very late stage of operationalization, and how can we bring those various expertise together in the context where it matters most, and completely agreeing with the fact that we're still very much in a humanitarian bubble, but as soon as the difficult questions will have to be asked on where do you prioritize 750 million when needs are in the trillions, these will be very, very difficult decisions, and that's where we need to kind of draw upon the huge amounts of experience from various communities practitioners in terms of research to how do you bring confidence and trust in the process in order that you don't find ourselves in a situation where the first that, the loudest or the more present are receiving assistance, but where it's needed most. And unfortunately, what we very often see, and that's experience from the humanitarian sector, is that where it's most difficult to go, where it's more challenging, very often we don't necessarily know what's happening there. So the importance of getting that data and making it available. Thank you.
So thanks from everyone here in Baku for everybody who's been joining online. Thank you so much to IOM and Impact Initiatives as the organizers of this event, and to OCHA for hosting us here in the Humanitarian Hub, and to this wonderful panel of speakers with your rich expertise. Wishing you all a good rest of day and all of us a good rest of COP.